Man orders pizza every day for 10 years when an employee realizes something is very wrong. Kirk Alexander, a 48-year-old man from Salem, Oregon, was without a doubt the greatest client a fast food restaurant could ever ask for. Believe it or not, Alexander ordered from his local Domino's Pizza every single day for nearly 10 years. That's right. And as you'd imagine, he eventually made friends with many of the workers at his favorite pizza place. Then, one seemingly ordinary day, Alexander did something so strange and uncharacteristic that it worried the entire Domino's restaurant. Soon enough, the staff knew that something needed to be wrong, so they took matters into their own hands and investigated. They just hoped they didn't discover the truth too late. Kirk Alexander, a 48-year-old man, lived alone in his secluded home in Salem, Oregon. Amongst his many passions, Alexander had one love that many of us share with him: a passion for pizza. However, not just any pizza would do for Alexander. You see, he was a Domino's man through and through. Alexander loved Domino's so much that he made sure to buy dinner from his local branch every day for nearly a decade. As Domino's general manager Sarah Fuller puts it, he orders every day, every other day. His order pops up on the screen because he orders online, so when we see it come across the screen and we're like, oh, Kirk's order. Like most routines in life, it became second nature to them to receive Alexander's nightly dinner request. One night, Fuller took over her shift at the Salem Domino's and everything started normally. The orders came in and went out with regularity, with a dinner rush coming around 5 p.m. as it always did. Throughout the entire dinner rush, Fuller could tell something was wrong and it gnawed at the back of her head. However, no matter how many times she checked the orders, stock, and her employees, she could find nothing wrong, so she shook it off and continued her work. Only after the dinner rush settled down did Fuller realize what was wrong. The restaurant hadn't received their favorite customer's order. For the first time in 10 years, Kirk Anderson hadn't ordered dinner from Domino's. Before jumping into any conclusions, the Domino's workers decided to take a deep breath and think about what Alexander hadn't ordered. Initially, they figured Alexander had left on vacation or a business trip. Of course, from there, the staff managed to think of more and more reasons why their favorite customer had decided not to order that night. Eventually, they decided to wait a few days and see if Alexander returned. However, another night passes and another, still with no sign of the man. The Salem Domino's staff began to feel extremely concerned about his well-being. That was when one of them brought up a truly terrible idea. Fuller and her coworkers at Domino's then began considering something quite heartbreaking. You see, they started to wonder if, for whatever reason, Alexander had simply gotten sick of their food. Was it something they did wrong that drove him away? Alexander had been ordering from them forever, so he clearly proved he enjoyed it for long enough. Did something change? It was like a bad relationship. Other employees thought he was just trying other food options or adopting a healthier diet. However, while these theories were intriguing, there were a few issues, and soon more alarming news would come to light. Many of the employees at the Domino's had a hard time believing Alexander would simply leave them high and dry. You see, he didn't just love pizza, he ordered from the entire menu. He simply loved Domino's. Kirk is a very well-known customer, but he doesn't have a regular order, Fuller explained. He'll order anything from pasta or pizza to sandwiches or wings. It's never the same thing every time. So as the days rolled on with still no word from Alexander, many started to think that some drastic measures needed to be taken. After all, they wanted to know that their favorite customer was okay. Soon they had a plan. After more than a week passed without an order from Kirk Alexander, manager Sarah Fuller decided that someone should go check on him, making sure everything was fine. To some people, this might seem like overkill considering none of these Domino's employees were family members or even close friends with Alexander. However, he was their most loyal customer and they wanted to treat him with the same respect he showed them. So instead of sitting around and waiting for Alexander to return someday, the Domino's staff decided to be proactive. And soon enough, they would be very happy with the fact that they followed their guts. Fuller elected Tracy Hamblin, seen here, to drive over to Alexander's home and see if he could make contact with the missing man. Like many of the other employees, Hamblin had built up a relationship with Alexander over the years and so took off with gusto. When Hamblin pulled into Alexander's driveway, he could see the lights were on inside his house. Not only that, but when he exited his car and approached the property, he could hear the TV playing as well. Curious, Hamblin inched his way closer. However, as the Domino's employee edged his way towards Alexander's front door, he could never have predicted what lay on the other side. Noting the light and television were on, Hamblin decided to knock on the front door. However, after he knocked, Alexander didn't answer. He knocked again, and once again, Alexander never came. It was like something out of a horror movie. That's when Hamblin had another great idea. He called Alexander's cell phone as he stood outside. To his disappointment, the phone rang and rang with no answer. That's when Hamblin knew that there was something definitely going on. At that point, Hamblin needed to decide if he wanted to stick around to try and find Alexander or call it quits. From the moment Hamblin arrived at Alexander's home, he got a sick feeling that something was terribly wrong. You see, most people just wouldn't leave the TV and lights on, especially if they're not home. This completely ruled out the staff's theories that Alexander could be out on vacation or visiting family. While Hamblin didn't see the point in sticking around any longer, he simply knew that something was wrong with their most loyal customer. Hoping that Fuller and his co-workers could figure something out, Hamblin left the Alexander home and went back to the restaurant to tell his co-workers what he'd found. Little did he know how close he had come to solving the mystery. Hamblin then drove as fast as he could back to the Domino's to let his fellow workers know what he'd discovered. While the Salem Domino's branch had hoped their favorite customer had been on vacation, what Hamblin found disproved that. When he returned to the store, Hamblin's story of a nearly abandoned home made one worker in particular worry even more. You see, the employee in question mentioned that Alexander had told them that his health wasn't always in the best shape. In fact, that's the reason why he would have his meal delivered to his door. All of a sudden, things were looking a lot worse. Between Hamblin's tale of Alexander's home and his healthcare concerns, Sarah Fuller on the right, the store manager, decided to see just how long it had been since he'd ordered. "We saw the last order was 11 days ago. We knew something wasn't right. That wasn't normal at all," she later told Salem's KOIN 6 News. To Fuller, this was the clincher. While Alexander could have possibly been on vacation for almost 2 weeks, the TV and health conditions ruled that out. So the staff began to think of ways they could finally figure out what happened to Alexander. That's when they knew exactly what had to be done. At this point, Fuller and her frightened employees decided to reach out to the local sheriff. After all, as far as they knew, Alexander had gotten himself into a very bad way. It seemed better to let the professionals handle the situation. At this point, Fuller picked up the phone, dialed 911, and explained the unsettling situation to the police officer on the other end of the line. "Well, I need some help on what to do. It could be an emergency," she said. "This is Domino's Pizza, and we have a customer that usually orders like every night from us, and he hasn't ordered in 11 days. The cop then took down all the details, immediately springing into action. After the call, local police officers headed out to Alexander's house in order to figure out what was going on. As soon as they arrived at his home, they, like Hamblin, noticed the lights were on and the TV was still playing. So they started pounding on the door and shouting his name. Soon enough, the neighbors were peeking their heads out the windows. While Hamblin had heard silence, the officers heard a strange muffled noise. As they listened closely, they realized they heard a man desperately crying out for help. Immediately, the police started bashing in the door. Within a few moments, one of the police officers managed to bash in the door, and the team quickly ran into the house and started looking for the missing man. In the kitchen, they found poor Alexander barely alive, lying on the floor and in desperate need of medical assistance. Of course, multiple officers immediately called for an ambulance on their radio, while others tried to stabilize the man. While Alexander was in terrible shape, at least he was alive. Who knows what would have happened had the excellent workers of Domino's not called the police when they did. Now the officers just hoped that Alexander would make it to the hospital in time. Within 2 minutes, the ambulance arrived at the home of Domino's customer Kirk Alexander and rushed him to the nearest hospital. As he entered the ER, the doctors first needed to stabilize him before they could determine what happened. Thankfully, they managed to do so quickly. Meanwhile, all the evidence pointed towards one thing. Alexander had suffered a massive stroke, which explains his inability to get off the floor in his home. However, while the doctors had stabilized him, Alexander was certainly not out of the woods. You see, he'd been on the floor without medical attention for too long. Doctors still worried about Alexander's long-term prospects. While doctors worked on Kirk Alexander in the hospital, police officers tried to piece together how something like this could even happen. As stated, due to his poor health, Alexander had all his meals delivered to him. Investigators also found out he lived alone, meaning no one could have known about the stroke and taken him to the hospital. Even worse, neighbors told police that Alexander rarely left his home, so they hadn't noticed his absence after his stroke. However, the people at Domino's had noticed his 11-day absence. Thanks to them, Alexander could have a second chance at a full life. Initially, the doctors felt concerned because there weren't any witnesses to Alexander's accident. Therefore, they had no clue how long he had been lying there after suffering the stroke. However, thanks to the police's diligent investigation, they managed to piece the puzzle together, helping save Alexander's life. After a long and painful wait, the doctors announced that Alexander would make a full recovery. As you might imagine, the Domino's staff felt ecstatic to hear this fantastic news. As Sarah Fuller emotionally put it, "We're like a family here, and we're glad we were able to do something to help. We hope he's able to fully recover from this." However, the team doesn't see themselves as anything special. As the story of Kirk Alexander and the amazing Domino's employees began to emerge, everyone started to think of them as some kind of heroes. However, the Domino's staff were having none of it. You see, they're still reluctant to accept the idea that they were somehow heroic. In their minds, you see, they'd simply done what any decent person would. "I think we were just doing our job, checking in on someone we know who orders a lot," Fuller said. "We felt like we needed to do something." However, as humble as Fuller and her fellow workers were, the media was not about to let this one go. Soon after Kirk Alexander entered the hospital, local news outlets started catching wind of this life-saving story. Afterward, many wanted to shed a spotlight on these heroic Domino's employees. Before long, it wasn't just the local networks, but also major news organizations, like the Washington Post, that wanted to tell their inspiring story. Meanwhile, as the story continued to grow and grow, many commenters began asking how Alexander was recovering after his terrible episode. After all, it's one thing to successfully recover, but it's another to adapt back to your daily routine after a stroke. And people demand answers. Soon enough, they'd receive them. A few weeks after the incredible incident, national news show Good Morning America invited Alexander, Fuller, and the Domino's crew onto their show. During the segment, Fuller, along with Domino's assistant manager Jenny Cyber, discussed everything that had transpired. As they recounted the unsettling events that took place and how they realized something was wrong, the host commended them both for their courage to follow their instincts. However, what the hosts of GMA really wanted to know was how Alexander was doing. Likewise, thousands of viewers also anxiously waited for their answer, and they felt stunned by what they heard. As they explained, Sarah Fuller and Jenny Cyber had already visited Alexander at the hospital a total of 3 times. The first time they visited, he seemed out of it and was barely able to speak. As a matter of fact, Alexander was only able to answer questions with yes or no on that occasion. However, by the second day, things had gotten a little better, though still not great. It was actually on the 3rd day that Alexander finally started looking and sounding like himself again. At that point, the doctors decided to move him to the rehabilitation wing, and his progress was looking great. However, the surprises were far from over. The Good Morning America team had some incredible surprises for the crew over at Domino's. Due to their unbelievable courage, keen attention to detail, and most important of all, their willingness to act, GMA decided to reward them with an exceptional present. As host Robin Roberts explained to the team, "Since you guys are superheroes, we're gonna send you to Captain America: Civil War." She then explained that the entire Domino's staff had just been gifted with movie tickets to see Captain America in theaters, as a way to pay them a tribute for their heroic actions. However, even after this kind gesture, the Domino's team's story was far from over. A few days after the Good Morning America piece, the police officers at Marion County Sheriff's Office, who discovered Alexander lying on the floor of his home, wrote a touching post on Facebook about the heroic actions of the Domino's employees. They especially praised Tracy Hamblin, the Domino's worker who was the first to check if anything was wrong at Alexander's home. Thanks to the quick actions of Mr. Hamblin, Mr. Alexander is in stable condition at the Salem Hospital. The officers wrote in their post, "While the Domino's team was now getting back to a normal life, there was still something to learn from this entire matter. Most people know that while pizza is undoubtedly delicious, it's not such the most nutritious and healthiest food. Therefore, it raises the question of whether or not Alexander's health issues may or may not have something to do with his excessive daily consumption of pizza." However, at the same time, it's safe to say that without the help of the Domino's staff, Alexander might not have lived to see another day. So even if pizza isn't the healthiest, in a roundabout way, the fact that he ate there every day, made friends with workers, and harbored goodwill actually saved his life. Meanwhile, Alexander must be thanking his lucky stars that he's still around to share his inspiring story. But this is far from the only story of a life-saving friendship. Throughout our lives, most of us develop many friendships. Some are short and fleeting, while others change us forever. No one knows this better than Clint Scales. Out of all of her friendships, none changed the life of Scales more than her friendship with Missouri police officer Jeff Colvin. They met when Scales was just a little girl. At only 9 years old, Scales would sit in front of her house to wave at her favorite police officer. Over time, they both started looking forward to seeing each other, a ray of sunshine in one another's life. Soon, weeks turned into months and the two developed a beautiful, deep bond. Then, one day, Scales vanished. Afterward, when Colvin heard her address on the radio, he knew he needed to respond. However, he had no idea that his actions would impact Scales every day for the rest of her life. Back in the late 90s, at the age of 9, Clint Scales lived in Kansas City, Missouri. On the outside, it looked like Clint enjoyed the life of any other 9-year-old girl. Unfortunately, the Scales were far from a happy household. Worse still, their life meant Clint never had a chance for a regular life like most girls her age. Everything about Clint's life represented a challenge. From where she lived to the environment her mother created, every step of Clint's life seemed like a hurdle. Then, in the middle of a hopeless world, the little girl finally found a ray of hope. Every part of little Clint Scales was anything but ordinary. To start with, her family lived in a dangerous neighborhood riddled with drugs, violence, and crime. As a result, Scales unfortunately became accustomed to police officers in and around her community. Regardless of her sad reality, Scales continually found ways to make the best of it. However, where the Scales family lived was only one of their many concerns. To make matters worse, the family scraped by on a single paycheck, unable to pay most their bills. So Clint had to help out in ways that no child should ever have to. Eventually, things became so bad for the Scales family that Clint had to resort to bad behavior she's not proud of. Often, the 9-year-old needed to steal food for her 2 younger brothers from the nearby 7-Eleven. Even at that age, Scales understood what she did was wrong. However, her family needed to eat and Clint did what she needed to. Even though Clint Scales felt terrible about stealing and would for the rest of her life, she'd still need to find a way to provide for her 2 brothers. Many of us would do exactly the same if we were in Clint's shoes. At just 9 years old, she'd started raising her 2 brothers. No 9-year-old girl should have to deal with the difficult situations Clint Scales did. Making matters even worse, her mother rarely spent much time at home. Instead, she needed to work long hours to keep a roof over her children's heads. So, as Scales was the eldest, her mother frequently relied on her to take care of her 2 brothers. As a result, Scales spent the majority of the time raising her brothers. She didn't receive the childhood with friends that so many of us were lucky enough to enjoy. That's certainly a lot to ask someone who hasn't even graduated middle school yet. However, Scales never backed down from the reality of the situation. With her mother missing, Clint Scales took responsibility of her brothers. Throughout her childhood, Scales provided and cared for them the best she could, herself a small child. The days were never easy for their young girl. Nevertheless, she cared for them with great love. Scales made sure her brothers had the fun childhood she never could. Unfortunately, the situations forced Scales to forget about her own childhood in order to better support her siblings. As a result, she had to mature at a very young age. Scales would starve herself in order to feed the little food she could find to her brothers. Sadly, she'd soon face the consequences of the poor nutrition she had. To find out what happened next, click on the link in the description below.